The following podcast is non-profit and is based on the IGCSE history curriculum. Hello again. In this episode, I'll just be speaking about the Berlin Blockade. By June 1948, Stalin had taken control of most of Eastern Europe. In response, the West had made Western Europe wealthy and pro-American. After the war, Germany and its capital Berlin were each divided into 4 zones of occupation: the British, French, American, and Soviet zones. Western Germany had always been a rich industrial area of Europe, so it was decided that Western Germany would be included in the plans to rebuild Europe. With this aim, the USA 1. Extended the Marshall Plan to the western zones of Germany, but not to the Soviet zone, as they knew that Stalin would reject the offer. 2. Combined American, British, and French zones together, creating a stronger zone that was much easier to manage. 3. In the Western Allied zone, a new currency was introduced, called the Deutschmark. It has begun to help Germany recover, but is much stronger than the currency in the Soviet zone. The Berlin Blockade began on the 24th of June, when the Soviets cut all land and water connections between the Allied zones and Berlin, and halted all traffic and trading in and out of Berlin. The Allies, the US, the UK, and France, responded by cutting trade and traffic from Western Germany into East Germany. The main reasons why Stalin began the blockade were to keep Germany weak and because he disliked the Marshall Plan. Also, the Western Allies had joined zones and introduced the Deutschmark currency, which was stronger than the Soviet currency. Therefore, it weakened the Soviet zone's economy and damaged communism and the USSR's reputation. The Berlin airlift began on the 26th of June 1948 and lasted until the 30th of September the next year. Over this time, the western zones of Germany flew more than 1.5 million tons of food, fuel, clothes, and equipment into Berlin, with around 1,000 flights landing each day. Surprisingly, Soviet forces did not fire on these planes and allowed them to pass over Soviet territory. By May 1949, Stalin had accepted that his attempt to force the Western Allies out of West Berlin had failed and called the blockade off. However, the Allies continued the airlift until September to build up a comfortable surplus of resources in case of another blockade. Now I'm going to go through some long-term and immediate effects. Firstly, I'll go through the immediate effects. 1. In 1949, the Western Allies set up a military alliance called NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in which they promised to defend each other if attacked. 2. The Berlin airlift significantly improved the relationship between the Allies and the Germans living in West Berlin, especially because they had been at war recently. 3. Germany became permanently divided into the Allied zone, Federal Republic of Germany, and the Soviet zone. Ironically, the German Democratic Republic, as we know that Soviet Union was not democratic. 4. The crisis was peacefully resolved by the airlifts and showed the West's commitment to the city. 5. The USSR and the Western Allies both increased propaganda against each other, as they both claimed victory. Now for the long-term effects. 1. Berlin became a symbol and the center of Cold War tensions, as the Americans saw Berlin as an island of democracy in the middle of communist repression, and the Soviets saw Western Berlin as an invasive cancer in East Germany. Due to the actions of the Soviet Union, many Americans became even more anti-communist, fearing future communist aggression in the West. They began to pressurize their governments into fighting communism globally. In 1955, the Soviets created the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance where the USSR and communist states of Eastern Europe promised to defend each other if they were under attack. Overall, the Berlin blockade was a failure for Stalin, because the West were able to show their support for the city of Berlin through airlifts of resources, thus strengthening Germany's relationship with the rest of Western Europe and lowering the popularity of communism and the USSR. Furthermore, the Berlin blockade was a success for Truman. Firstly, because it strengthened the relationship with Germany and showed that life was better when capitalist countries united together. Secondly, Western Germany was developed and strengthened. Third, the military alliance, NATO, was agreed. 4. Even for the Allies in general, it improved their relationship with Germany, as it showed their dedication and support towards Berlin despite the fact that they had been at war only a few years prior. Now, let's move on to discussing the Berlin Wall. The construction of the Berlin Wall began on August the 13th, 1961. Why was it built? Firstly, West Germany was much more prosperous than East Germany. West Germans had a better standard of living than those in the East, and West Germany was an advertisement for the economic successes of Western capitalist Europe. Secondly, Germans could move freely between East Germany and West Berlin. Between 1949 and 1960, 3 million East Germans had fled to the West through Berlin. Many of these were young, talented, and well-educated people. This was known as the brain drain. Thirdly, West Berlin was used as a headquarters for Western governments to spy on Eastern Europe and the USSR. Did the Berlin Wall reduce Cold War tensions? On the one hand, it successfully reduced Cold War tensions. Firstly, it prevented a war because the US decided it was not worth fighting for and let the USSR have their privacy. Secondly, the wall had Soviets the safety and security that they wanted from Germany as a result of the Second World War. On the other hand, it failed to reduce Cold War tensions. Firstly, the West became even more suspicious of the Soviets and were unaware about what was happening. Secondly, Germans in West and East Germany had begun to lose faith in the Western countries because they were not standing up and fighting for their freedom. The demolition of the wall began on the 13th of June 1990. It was a triumphant moment. On the 3rd of October 1990, West and East Germany were reunited, and the destruction of the wall was completed in November 1991. Before German reunification, the much more liberal Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, said that it was no longer the Soviets' decision to split Germany, but it was up to Germany to decide whether to reunite or not. I'd just like to additionally go through what the Berlin Wall looked like. Firstly, the wall simply began as a barbed wire fence. However, it quickly developed into a significant and well-guarded barrier between East and West Berlin. The Berlin Wall consisted of watchtowers which were staffed by guards 24 hours a day, tank traps which were spikes laid on the ground to halt advancing tanks, a concrete wall, reinforced concrete to stop people from East Berlin from escaping, spike mats of spikes that were positioned on the ground to halt cars of other vehicles with tyres, floodlights, these illuminated the strip between East and West Berlin, the inner fence, which was a wire fence that was electrified and alarmed, the death strip, a sandy area with ditches before the wall with West Berlin, the border wall, a tall concrete wall before West Berlin, which had a rounded top that was difficult to climb over, the patrol road, a road down the wall in which vehicles, guards, and guard dogs could patrol the wall. Soldiers were stationed at the Berlin Wall in order to shoot anyone trying to defect. This is the end of the podcast. Thank you for listening.